First, live, local. This is Fox 12 Now.
Everyone, welcome back to Fox 12 Now. I'm Greg Nibbler. We always appreciate you joining us. We are live streaming across all of our Fox 12 Oregon platforms and on YouTube. So you can always check in with us here every weekday when we are going live, but you can also watch all of our segments afterward. So we appreciate that whenever it is that you are tuning in, and feel free to share these segments. We get to cover a lot of topics here on this show. And right now we're talking about something that's been, well, it sounds like 20 years in the making. This is an Oregon State University study and research project for a Geoelectric map of the United States. And there is a lot that goes into this and a lot of ramifications, a lot of great things that could happen from this. We're going to talk about all that right now with the principal investigator, Adam Schultz, from this project. And there's so much going on here. I don't want to mess it up by trying to explain everything that's happening in this project. So Adam, thank you for joining us to do this. And, you know, I think to start off, to give everybody just a base understanding, can you tell us what this study is and even why it began in the first place?
I'm happy to do that, and thanks for having me on today, Greg. Yeah, let's talk about geoelectric mapping. You can imagine that, or you might think that for a century or more, we've had a complete geological map of the United States. But that's a surface map, right? That's based on surface observations. And we really didn't have a good handle on what was really going on in glorious 3 dimensions underground. And to do that, we need to bring in geophysics, which can look below ground using a variety of methods. Now, geophysical methods depend on material properties of the rocks and minerals making up the Earth's crust and mantle. And one of the properties is the electrical conductivity of the materials. And we didn't have such a map. We didn't have a 3D view of the geoelectric properties of the Earth's crust and the upper mantle beneath the United States, or beneath any continent for that matter. So about 20 years ago, the U.S. geophysical academic community got together and proposed an audacious project called EarthScope. And they proposed this to the National Science Foundation. And it was to combine a whole series of different geophysical methods and to obtain that first ever 3-dimensional geophysical map, or geological map in 3D, of the conterminous United States and in some parts of Alaska as well. And this took an act of Congress to fund because it was a huge project, and it did get funded. So the EarthScope project got funded, and one of the elements of that was to look at the electrical properties, how the electrical conductivity of the Earth's crust and mantle varies in all 3 dimensions. And then to relate that to, say, the composition of the rocks and minerals, the temperature, the presence of various fluids, things like that, as you go down to greater and greater depth. And in this case, we aim to do a 3D view below ground level down to about 300 kilometers. So to do that, yeah, so that was groundbreaking. People had not envisioned doing something like that on the scale of an entire continent before. And other countries since then have been inspired by this. There's a similar project underway in Australia now. There's another one in China. And you know, this has got a lot of momentum. One unique thing about our project, normally when you are a scientist and you get funded after you proposed a project, and getting funded is an effort, you usually get to own the data for a period of time, so your lab gets to have proprietary use of it to get your publications out and all the rest, and then eventually it goes public and goes into a database. This project was unique because we never owned the data. The data went out immediately. The raw data and the processed data that we processed went to a national archive that was open to the public without restriction. And so that's kind of groundbreaking in its own right. So that's kind of the background of it. Oregon State University was one of the founding organizations in the geoelectromagnetic mapping part of this. And as the project evolved, we became the central organization to execute the project, collect the data, and push it out there in archive form.
Wow, I mean, that's so much that you just covered just even in this explainer, which did explain quite a bit with that. I got a bunch of questions. So starting off, you know, mapping 300 kilometers underneath the surface of the Earth. I mean, that is so much deeper than I thought it was going to be when you started talking about this. So technologically, I mean, starting off 20 years ago, I imagine it's just exponentially different now, the things that you have available. But I mean, how did you go about do that? What kind of equipment is needed in order to do that?
Well, you'll be amazed. The fundamental equipment that we started with is exactly the equipment we ended with. So we had consistency and calibrations didn't change, but we continuously improved it and upgraded it and added things like telemetry, real-time telemetry, instead of just recording in the boxes. The way we do this is we measure at ground level at a series of points, grid points across the continent for a period of time, the electric and magnetic fields. Now, the electric fields and the magnetic fields at ground level are caused by interactions between the solar wind, the charged particles coming out of the sun, and the Earth's magnetic field. And during big solar storms, you get very famously things like the aurora, right? We had a big aurora earlier in the year, right? A few months ago, made the news, and then this week as well, right? We had another one that some people in Oregon could also see. So those currents up in the above the atmosphere and the ionosphere induce electric currents and magnetic fields in the ground and below ground, and we measure those at ground level. And it takes a footprint of about 100 meters on its side to measure the electric fields with our sensor array, and we also have magnetometers that measure the magnetic field. And depending on signal levels and noise levels, we may be at a particular location anywhere from a week, more typically around 3 weeks, and sometimes for 3 months. It depends. It's site dependent. It depends also where we are in the 11-year solar cycle, because the sun's activity oscillates periodically. And right now we're at a peak of the solar cycle, so there's plenty of geomagnetic storms, and we get good signal levels, so we're not there as long. But in any event, we do this at each of these sites. We went eventually over almost 19 years to over 1,700 locations across the US on a more or less regularly spaced grid. And because it was a nice grid like that, at every location, we're seeing vertically down from that location as well as laterally off to the side. And so you put this all together through some very complicated mathematics, and you can create an image in 3D below ground of how the electrical conductivity varies from place to place. And then you can relate that to other data and put the story together of how the continent was formed, where mineral resources are likely to be, where there may be geothermal resources, where there may be higher or lower natural hazards. And in the course of doing this, it became obvious about midway through the data we were collecting was also critically important to the electric power grid, which hadn't been anticipated before, because what happens is you get electric currents that flow in the earth because of the solar activity, but the power grid, the transmission lines, are grounded to the earth, so the electric currents get into the transmission lines. And when the power grid was designed all those years ago, they didn't really know about this. And so the grid wasn't designed to handle these extra currents, and they can be very intense during a big geomagnetic storm. And so the power industry and the regulators have been coming to grips with this, because there have been cases where substations fail or even entire regions go black. Very famously in 1989, in Quebec in Canada, the whole province went down. The power grid failed. That had implications across North America because the grid's all interconnected. And so we can't have that happen, right? Everything depends on reliable power. And so getting to terms with these geomagnetically induced currents in the power grid, it turns out the kind of mapping we were doing was critical information to the power utilities, because they could better predict which of their substations would be at risk and have plans in place to mitigate that risk, so they could prevent damage to components, and they could also prevent instability in the power grid and basically keep the lights on. So that became the driving force after 2018. Our funding, continued funding to complete the project, actually depended on that, even though this started out purely as a basic geoscience project.
But then once you get, those utility companies involved, then that changes everything, I would imagine, too, as far as funding being brought in and the importance of that, because that does tie into so much. So when you look at it, from the utility company standpoint, and from general consumers of electricity. How many times has that, I mean, there's probably not an exact number, but how often do you think that those disturbances from either solar or geomagnetic or whatever else is going on with the Earth, how many times do you think that that has disrupted power service and we just didn't realize it?
Yeah, that's a huge question because this is considered sensitive information by the utilities and by the regulators.
Gotcha.
So they don't like talking about this, and rightly so. Because there are other ways one could take advantage of these moments when the grid is under stress that could make things worse. So what I can say with firm assurance, however, because I do have a number of contacts throughout the power industry, that it is an issue. It does happen. We had a very, very close call in 2012, actually. In 2012, an absolutely enormous solar coronal mass ejection. This is one of these really big solar flares that's big enough to escape the sun and go off into space, and had it slammed directly into the Earth, the estimates were that it would profoundly bring down the power grid, on a national scale. And the ramifications of that were really dire because all of a sudden, everything depends on power, right? You can't pump gas, you can't pump water, no systems work. And that was a really scary scenario. And we got lucky because that coronal mass ejection just glanced by the Earth. We didn't really get hit by it. If we'd been slightly ahead or behind in our orbit, and there was a head-on collision, we would have been in deep trouble. So the federal government, as well as the power industry, kind of put a red flag up and said, okay, we've got to deal with this. And this eventually led to the regulatory environment requiring the power industry to do certain things. It eventually led to a presidential executive order being signed that basically ordered that the geoelectric mapping of the United States be completed, which was the activity we were doing. And so that allowed us to continue our work after other sources of funding had ended, and we brought it to a successful conclusion. So I think it's a happy story. I think, this combination of science and regulators and power industry, which is very complicated. You can imagine all the competing interests. We just went through a big storm event, a couple of months ago, and there were no wide-scale failures. And I like to think that what we've done has had some positive role in keeping the lights on.
Yeah, quite literally keeping the lights on.
Yeah.
Looking at the project, from the beginning where you're trying to get funding and all of the work that you do for that to where now it's a presidential order, it's like, no, you're going to do this work. This is how important this is. Yeah, what a change over that time, but it shows how important that is. All of this information and data getting into the hands of everybody. So going forward, are there ways for, and again, some of this may be proprietary and things that we can't, that you can't talk about it. So if that's the case, let me know. But are there things that can be done to retrofit or retrograde our systems now to stabilize that and make sure that some of these disruptions don't happen that could have happened before?
Yes, there are basically two approaches. There are a number of companies that produce various devices that can go on these enormous transformers that underpin the power transmission network, right? That's the big problem. There's some debate in the industry over whether these methods are totally effective or whether they pass the buck down to the next substation from the substation they're protecting. But because of the information that we now have from our project, we can guide the industry in identifying which of those substations are the ones most at risk. And they're in areas that hadn't been anticipated before these data sets were available. And that also gives the utility operators the ability to dynamically reconfigure where the power flows during one of these events, because they'll know which of their transformers is likely to go hot, go under stress during the event, and they can kind of dynamically shunt things around that so they can take the load off those at-risk transformers. So it becomes a dynamic control process. So between the two kind of methods of changing the hardware or upgrading or retrofitting the hardware and dynamically controlling the grid, that's kind of the approach that seems to be working. And now, of course, the grid has to expand, right? There's so much more demand for electricity, particularly as we go to a zero carbon economy and more things become electrified. having this information is helpful as new transmission lines go in and new feeder lines come off of that. So it's just very timely information for the power utilities.
Yeah, very timely and really great to have it. I mean, this is invaluable information because just as you mentioned, as everything's going towards more electrification, this is so important. Beyond just the power grid and understanding that and taking care of those issues, what other kinds of data or projects can you extrapolate from this data, I guess?
Oh yeah, we're going back to the roots of the project, which was basic, geological science. And for example, in the Pacific Northwest here, from these data, we can see the deep roots of the Cascade volcanoes. We can see where the melt is coming from, from the magma sources below at great depth. We can see, for example, we're sitting in a subduction zone, right? A famous Cascadia subduction zone. So you've got the oceanic plates diving under the North American plate, right here. And we can see some interesting things. For example, there's kind of a train wreck of the top of those plates, which is basically seafloor material, and the top of the plate kind of wedging against the continent, getting scraped up. Not all of it subducts under North America. So we can actually see that happening. There's something we call the accretionary wedge just at the coast. But underneath, you can actually see strong variations in the electrical properties in the area just above the subducting plate. And we call that the mantle wedge. And that mantle wedge, which is sitting just under the North American crust where we live, right? Where Portland is, where we are in Corvallis, we're sitting right above that. That area has fluids in certain places that are percolating up from the downgoing subducting plate. And those fluids may well play an important role in the inception of earthquakes. They may, in some sense, be lubricating the plate in some places. In other places, the fluids are absent, and that lubrication isn't there. But we're not sure how the lubrication changes over time. So this is kind of the initial 3D snapshot of what it looks like, and we actually are going to propose to go back and then do continuous monitoring all along the Cascadia margin to see if we can see the impact of fluids redistributing and how that may play a role in the release of earthquake energy. So it has a role here, but there are other parts of the country. If you're interviewing me from the upper Midwest, I talk about the mid-continent rift that we've imaged, which was the source of the iron formations. That is why the Great Lakes region was such a powerhouse in the Industrial Revolution, because they had iron near the surface and other critical minerals. And we now know why they're there and how they extend all across the mid-continent. We discovered as you cross from the East Coast into the Appalachian and Piedmont, there's a huge change in the thickness of the rigid part of the Earth, the outer rigid part, the crust and upper mantle. There's a huge change, and that actually has a big impact on, going back to the power grid, on the intensity of the geomagnetically induced currents going into the power grid that hadn't been appreciated before. So places like Washington, D.C. that were considered low risk, or maybe not so low risk, of impacts from these space weather events. So there's a lot to parse here, because this is a data set that's out for all scientists and the general public to have access to in the industry, and they're going to be making discoveries off this data set for decades.
Wow. I mean, and with just the constant improvement of technology and just the ability to parse through that data, utilizing AI or something along those lines, I would imagine, would also exponentially increase the information that can come out of this.
Exactly. I mean, this was kind of the Geophysical Human Genome Project, right? It was like the space shot for us, where before we had a patchwork quilt of a few little local and regional studies of this sort, but to put it all together, to overlay what we've done with what the seismologists have done, with what the Earth deformation geodesists have done, and then other studies, for mineral exploration, critical mineral exploration, for example. I'm very interested in geothermal power, something Oregon has a big potential for. And again, having this kind of collection of different data sets that can be overlaid will guide us into finding those resources. If we're ever going to go to a zero carbon economy, we have to massively expand our access to critical minerals, right? Even copper. we don't have anywhere near enough copper to become an electrified economy. Where's that coming from, right? So you need this sort of Lewis and Clark style 3D across the continent view of what's underground, and this has played at least a part of that.
And with that, you could predict where copper is most likely to be found.
We certainly can help, not just copper. It's really all natural resources of interest, the critical minerals and energy resources. And I'm thinking of the renewable energies, resources in particular. Yeah.
Yeah, you look at the geothermal, all this, there's a lot of projects that I know that are going on in the state of Oregon or planned to get started. We've done some coverage on that, but I can imagine that would really help out them in knowing where to set up those projects at, and let alone aquifers and all kinds of information. I mean, that's just amazing.
Absolutely.
Wow. Well, congratulations. That's an incredible achievement, and obviously has so many different benefits for so many different people, and everyone out there, everybody who's watching is going to benefit from this hard work that you've done. Adam, incredible.
Thank you. Thank you. It was quite an adventure over a good chunk of 20 years, but here we are. We did it.
So what comes next now that this has happened?
Oh, well, as I mentioned, we'd like to go back to the Cascadia margin, west of the Cascades, and start continuously monitoring things rather than just having a single 3D snapshot. 3D is great, 4D is better. So we want to do that. We're doing a lot of, you mentioned geothermal. We're doing a lot of really high resolution work in areas of potential geothermal resources. I think that's going to be a large part of my research interest going forward.
Well, thank you very much for having some time to talk to us today just about this and share this information. I mean, and Oregon State University, man, come on. I love it. That's, leading the way on that. I am an OSU alum as well. So,
awesome.
Yeah, man, thank you very much, for joining me. I know it's a long conversation, but just such good information, such a lot to learn from that, and really appreciate you joining me here today on Fox 12 Now.
Thanks for the invitation, Greg. I appreciate it.
Yeah, anytime. Yeah. And for everybody watching,
awesome.
Thanks for joining us too. We are live. We're going to take a break here, but if there's breaking news, we will have that as well here on Fox 12 Now. We will live stream throughout the afternoon, anytime between 1 p.m. and 4 p.m. outside of our other newscasts. This is the place to go for breaking news or interesting conversations like we just had. So all kinds of stuff that we cover here on this show. Check it all out on our YouTube channel, or of course, KPTV.com. Click on the Fox 12 Now tab or the Fox 12 Oregon app. Lots of places to find it and share it afterwards. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. We'll sign off for now. I'm Greg Nibbler. This is Fox 12 Now.